Welcome back to Talk Tensors. As always, we're diving into the cutting edge of ML research, and today's paper is a really interesting one.
That is.
It's tackling a problem that's fundamental to education, talking about multiple choice questions, MCQs, figuring out how hard they are.
Right.
But it's not just about the right answer. It's about those tricky distractors.
Yeah. The wrong answers, but they're designed to, kind of throw you off the scent, see if you really know your stuff.
Exactly. And this paper uses these big, powerful, large language models to predict just how hard an MCQ is going to be.
It's really clever how they do it, too.
Yeah, I was impressed.
Yeah.
Before we unpack all of that, though, can you remind our listeners, why is this such a big deal?
Sure. So for folks like us who are interested in using machine learning to make education better, this paper is huge.
Huge, okay.
Yeah, because up until now, trying to figure out how hard a question is, well, it's been a lot of guesswork, relying on experts to just eyeball it or doing tons of testing beforehand.
Yeah, time-consuming and expensive.
Exactly. And this research gives us a way to do it automatically, and not just automatically, but way more accurately than we could before. So it has the potential to really change how we design tests and measure learning.
I like it. All right, let's get into the nitty-gritty. How do they actually do it?
So they start by framing it as a regression problem. Basically, they're trying to predict a number for each MCQ.
Okay, a difficulty score.
Exactly. And their method has four main parts to it, four modules.
Okay.
The first one uses GPT-4, the O variant, which means it's been fine-tuned for reasoning. They use that to generate the reasoning steps, like how you'd solve the problem to get the right answer.
Okay, makes sense.
But here's the cool part. They also use it to generate feedback for each wrong answer, each distractor, like explaining why a student might pick that wrong answer.
So not just how to get it right, but how you might get it wrong.
Right.
Interesting.
So say you have a simple math problem, like the sum of three consecutive even numbers is 48. What is the middle value?
The answer is 16, right?
Yeah, and GPT-4o would actually lay out the algebra steps you'd use to get to 16. But then for a distractor, let's say 14, it might say, oh, a student might pick this because they messed up their addition somewhere, or they forgot to account for the even numbers part.
So it's simulating how a student might think, including their mistakes.
Exactly. It's going beyond just reading the words on the page. It's like getting inside the head of a student.
And that gives a model a much deeper understanding of what makes a question hard.
Yeah, exactly. It's really different from those older machine learning methods that just looked at the words themselves, like how long they were or how complex the grammar was.
Right, surface level stuff. Okay, so what happens after GPT-4o does its thing?
That's where the second module comes in. So they take all that information, the question itself, all the answer choices, and the reasoning and feedback that GPT-4o generated, and they feed it into Longformer.
Oh, Longformer, I like that one.
Yeah, it's a great model, and it's perfect for this because it can handle these really long chunks of text.
Right, it has a huge context window.
Exactly. So what Longformer does is it crunches all that text and spits out a latent feature vector for each answer choice.
Okay, so it's like summarizing each choice with a bunch of numbers.
Yeah, basically. It's like a numerical fingerprint that captures the meaning of the choice, including why it might be right or wrong.
Okay, I'm following so far. 2 modules down, what's next?
Module number 3 is where things get really interesting. It's where they connect this to real educational theory, specifically item response theory, or IRT.
IRT, haven't heard that one in a while.
Yeah, it's a big deal in educational measurement. It's how we understand and model learning and difficulty.
Okay, so what do they do with it?
They simulate a whole bunch of students with different knowledge levels. Like, imagine a classroom with a bunch of kids. Some are really good at math, some are still learning.
Yeah, okay, I'm picturing it.
They sample these students from a standard multivariate normal distribution. It's a fancy way of saying they create a bunch of students with different strengths and weaknesses in different areas of knowledge.
Okay, and they're all virtual, right? These are simulated students.
Exactly, yeah. And then they use a multi-layer perceptron, or MLP, it's like a neural network, to predict how likely each of these simulated students is to pick each answer choice.
So it's like they're giving a test to 1,000 virtual students.
Exactly. That's a good way to put it. And the MLP is figuring out, okay, this student who's good at algebra but not so good at arithmetic, they're probably going to pick the right answer here, but they might get tricked by this distractor.
So it's not just about how hard the question is on its own. It's about how hard it is for different types of students.
Right, and that's the genius of bringing IRT into this. You're looking at difficulty from the perspective of a whole range of student abilities.
Okay, so the MLP gives you a bunch of likelihood scores, one for each student and each answer choice. What do you do with all of that?
That's where the fourth and final module comes in. They take all those likelihood scores and average them for each answer choice. So now you have one number for each choice that tells you, on average, how likely students are to pick it.
Okay, I'm with you.
And then they feed those average likelihoods into another MLP.
Another one.
Yeah. And this one finally predicts the overall difficulty of the MCQ. The intuition is, if most students are likely to pick the right answer, then it's probably an easy question. But if they're kind of split between all the choices, then those distractors are doing their job, and it's a tougher question.
It makes sense when you lay it out like that. So they've got this four-part system. How do they actually train it?
They do some pretty sophisticated stuff with the training, so they don't just compare their predicted difficulty to the actual difficulty, which they get from IRT analysis of real student responses. They also use this thing called Kullback-Leibler divergence, KL divergence for short.
Oh, KL divergence. I vaguely remember that from grad school.
It's a way of measuring how different two probability distributions are. So they're basically saying, we don't just want the difficulty score to be right. We also want our simulated students to make the same kinds of mistakes that real students do.
Right, so it's almost like making the simulation more realistic?
Yeah, it's making sure their simulated students are behaving like real students, statistically speaking.
Okay, that's clever. So how well did it work?
Well, they tested it on 2 real-world data sets of math MCQs. One was from an adult proficiency test, and the other was from this educational platform called EDI.
Okay, real data, that's important.
Yeah, and both data sets had a lot of questions, and importantly, they had the actual difficulty values based on real student responses, so they could compare their predictions to the truth.
Great. Control group.
Exactly. And they compared their method to a few simpler methods like linear regression, using basic text features and fine-tuning Longformer just on the question text without all the reasoning and feedback stuff.
So they had a few benchmarks to compare against.
Right. And the results were really impressive. Their method beat all the other methods by a lot. They had much lower mean squared error and higher R squared, which basically means their model was better at explaining the differences in difficulty between questions.
So their fancy system with all the reasoning and simulation really paid off.
It totally did. They also did some qualitative analysis, looking at specific questions to see why their model worked so well. There was this one example, a simple equation-solving problem. And they showed how the reasoning and feedback that GPT-4o generated helped their model understand why one wrong answer was particularly tempting for students.
So they could see the model picking up on those subtle nuances that make a question hard.
Yeah, exactly. And because of that, it could predict the difficulty more accurately than the simpler models that just looked at the words.
Okay, I'm sold. Anything else that jumped out at you from this paper?
There was one more thing, figure 2. It showed the distribution of the simulated student knowledge levels. And they found this interesting thing. The distribution was bipolar, meaning most of the simulated students were either really good or really bad at math.
Like 2 extremes.
Yeah, and the researchers think this might actually reflect how students perform in the real world. You often have high achievers and then students who are really struggling.
That's interesting. It's different from what you'd expect from a standard bell curve, right?
Exactly. And it kind of challenges some of the assumptions we make in IRT, that student abilities are normally distributed.
So it raises some really interesting questions about how we model student learning and how well those models match reality.
Exactly. It's like, hey, are we making the right assumptions here?
I like it. Always good to question the assumptions. So to zoom out a little bit, where does this paper fit in the big picture of ML for education?
Well, predicting MCQ difficulty has been a hot topic for a while. People have tried all sorts of things, from analyzing word length and readability scores to using TF-IDF and word embeddings like Word2Vec.
The classic NLP toolkit.
Yeah, and then neural networks came along and people started using LSTMs and BILSTMs to capture more complex relationships in the text.
Probably more sophisticated models.
Exactly. And more recently, LLMs have really shaken things up. They're showing incredible promise in extracting really nuanced features from the text. Some people have even tried using them to directly predict how likely students are to pick each answer choice.
So this paper builds on all of that.
Yeah, it takes the best of what we've learned so far and adds this clever twist with the reasoning generation and the IRT-inspired student simulation.
So it's not just about the LLM, it's about how they're using it.
Right. It's about integrating it with existing educational theory and really thinking about the cognitive processes involved in answering a question.
All right, so let's wrap up with our novel notions segment. We always like to leave our listeners with some food for thought. So picking up on that point about the student knowledge distribution, they assumed it was a standard normal distribution. But what if we could make that more dynamic, more data-driven?
That's a great question. The authors actually hint at this in their future work section. Imagine if the model could actually learn the knowledge distribution from real student data. Instead of assuming it's a bell curve, it could adapt to the specific population being tested.
So it'd be like personalizing the difficulty prediction to the students who are actually taking the test.
Yeah, it could make adaptive testing even more accurate and efficient. And it could give us some really valuable insights into how different groups of students learn.
That's a cool idea. What else could we explore based on this work?
Another exciting direction would be to see if we can predict not just the difficulty of a question, but also the discrimination parameter from IRT.
Discrimination, remind me what that is again.
Discrimination tells us how well a question differentiates between high-achieving and low-achieving students. So a highly discriminating question would be one where the good students get it right and the struggling students get it wrong.
Okay, I see.
And since this model is already analyzing the question content and simulating student knowledge levels, it might be possible to predict discrimination as well. It would just need some tweaks to the output and maybe incorporate some IRT likelihood functions into the training.
That's a really interesting thought. We could use machine learning to design tests that are not only the right difficulty, but also really good at measuring student learning.
Exactly. It's like taking test design to a whole new level.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive. As always, we'll have a link to the paper in the show notes for anyone who wants to dig deeper.
Definitely worth a read. It's a great example of how machine learning can be used to tackle real-world problems in education.
And that's it for this episode of Talk Tensors. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you next time for another exciting exploration of the latest and greatest in ML research. And until then, here's something to ponder. How might these advancements in predicting question difficulty change the way we think about personalized and adaptive learning? Food for thought.
Indeed, a lot to think about. Until next time.
See you then.